Welcome to the midwinter break video number 5 and the last video in our midwinter break series on the Renaissance. And today we're looking at Michelangelo and his hammer, specifically sculptures by Michelangelo, his David and his dying and rebellious prisoner slaves. Okay, so here's a close-up of Michelangelo's David, and we're going to talk a little bit about why there is so much depth and almost an unrealistic nature within his hairline. Okay. So, but before we get to more in depth about the David, we're going to look specifically at the dying or rebellious slaves. Some people also call them the prisoners. And these are works of art by Michelangelo that are in an unfinished state. They are some of the finest examples of Michelangelo's habitual working practice. They're referred to as non finito or incomplete. Magnificent illustrations of the difficulty of the artist in carving out the figure from the block of marble and emblematic of the struggle of man to free the spirit from matter. These sculptures have been interpreted in many different ways. As we see them, as they're lined up below, in various stages of completion, they evoke the enormous strength of the creative concept as they try to free themselves from the bonds of physical weight of the marble. It is now claimed that the artist deliberately left them incomplete to represent this eternal struggle of human beings to free themselves from their material trappings. And at the time in Florence, there was a whole, the Renaissance was a rebirth, but a rebirth of so many different things, not just art, but also philosophy and literature, many different types of, and sciences. So there's a lot of things going on. And one of the biggest movements in Florence at the time is this sense of Platonic theory. And Michelangelo really studied Plato and looked at how Plato observed an artist. And in Plato's writings, Plato believed that an artist was twice removed from the actual natural being because God created a being. The artist saw the being, and then the artist created a being out of something else. So it was almost 3 times removed from the actual state. Michelangelo also believed, which is a Platonic theory, that he was releasing a figure from the stone. He believed that he could see this image embedded in a piece of marble. When he chose his pieces of marble, he would look at them and say, what do I see in there? And he would actually see this being. He believed that God was actually moving his chisel and his hammer and releasing this figure from the stone below, which is a very Platonic concept at the time. So many people believe that these dying or rebellious slaves are an example of that type of struggle, of that image being released from the stone, the being being released from its surroundings. Again, that complete Platonic theory. These pictures do not do these pieces justice, but you can see in this middle area here that I have an example of a close-up of something that Michelangelo created. And so if we look here at this close-up here, right here, we can see these actual chisel marks. What is going on? And that is probably the most magnificent part of these dying and rebellious slaves, is that you can really get a sense of what Michelangelo was doing. You can get a sense of how he is releasing this body from the stone and how his mind thinks as he is creating these sculptures as he goes through. And again, these couple pictures don't really truly do this justice, but it was a great way to really see into Michelangelo's mind. So as we go on, we're going to look more in-depthly now at the David by Michelangelo. And the David is obviously one of, as we stated before, his most recognizable works and has become one of the most recognizable statues in the entire world of art. It stands 13 feet tall, 13 and a half feet tall. The double life-size David is depicted patiently waiting for battle, prepped with a slingshot in one hand and a stone in the other. He was commissioned to carve the biblical David, Michelangelo was, for the outside of the Florence Cathedral. Now, we've already talked about the Florence Cathedral, okay, which was created the dome by Brunelleschi. Because the statue was intended to be placed in a high location on the church, it had to be large enough to be seen from below. So today, its residence it obviously is not outside of the cathedral, but inside the comfortable confines of the Accademia Museum in Florence. So if we look here at some of these images, we see some statues in niches above the Duomo entrance. Okay, now we have to remember that Michelangelo's David was meant to go into one of these niches. So there's going to be little concepts about the David that are going to be slightly different. For example, when we look into his hair is carved very, very deep, okay? There's certain aspects of him that are different, like his hair, for instance, like his hands are very much larger than the average human hand, and so is his head and his hair. Well, that was done because he thought that the David would actually be viewed from above, at least 2 stories high. So if you were going to look up, straight up at the David, okay, you want there to be as much depth in your sculpture as possible. So he created this type of image to be viewed from 2 stories down. Obviously, now that we don't look at the David at that type of angle, it's a little different and doesn't always look as proportionate as it should be, but that's why. So here we're going to look specifically at some of the aspects of the David. The David here we are presented with is obviously a nude male, very muscular in physique. His veins are very visible in his arms and hands as he clutches the stones with one hand, okay, his right hand, and in his other hand, he has the slingshot. His hands, obviously, as I just stated, and his head appear to be disproportional large for his body, because he was supposed to be higher up on viewed from the Duomo. Okay, but his left leg is also, which straddles the rocky base upon which he stands, appears a little too big and a little long for his body. It accentuates the line of his leg as it forms an essential component of David's contrapposto stance. We all know what contrapposto is. Like the ancient Hellenistic and Roman sculptors who were masters at convincingly depicting the human anatomy, Michelangelo has depicted David that his body responds to the stance that he is in. David's weight has been placed on his right leg while his left leg is at rest, which again is the definition of contrapposto. Because of this, his hips have shifted, with one side being higher than the other. In turn, this has caused David's spine and midsection to curve slightly, and his right shoulder drops slightly below his left one, okay? Which again is the aspects of contrapposto. Now, if we look at the David and we really compare it to its counterpart of Donatello's David, there are some similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. They were both, the cast bronze David was created in Florence. It was half century earlier, but we do see those similarities and differences. Both are very heroic nudes, standing in contrapposto, though Donatello dressed his figure in boots and a hat, unlike the semi boy that Donatello created. Michelangelo presented David as a strong and assured man, stripped of any other objects associated with the biblical narrative. such as the head of Goliath or the sword, which you see in Donatello's work of art. Instead, David stands alone with only his slingshot and stones almost hidden on his person. Scale is also an important consideration since Donatello's David is pretty much less than half the size of Michelangelo's. In fact, Michelangelo presents us with David in giant form, which is kind of ironic since his enemy is actually a giant. The colossal size is significant because it was the first time that a large-scale nude statue was made in the Renaissance since antiquity. But perhaps even more striking is the timing in the narrative at which we see David, as depicted by Donatello and Michelangelo. The earlier sculpture of Donatello shows us the David right after the fight. He's already slayed Goliath. He's standing on his head in a very heroic fashion. Okay, but Michelangelo instead shows us the David before battle and before victory. So you see this sense of determination and his concentration, furrowed brow as he stares off into the distance. This is a figure who is focused rather than one who is contemplating the past. And you can really sense those types of feelings and emotions as we go through it. After it was completed, Michelangelo's David became a civic symbol for Florence. Even though it was ultimately a religious sculpture at the time, the early 1500s was a time of turbulence in Florence. It was between the city and a former ruling family, the Medicis. So now the Medicis were seen as aggressors or tyrants, and it had been kicked out of Florence. Florentines adopted the David statue as a symbol of their own struggle against the Medici. And in 1504, they decided that Michelangelo's creation was too good to place high up on the cathedral. Instead, they put it in a much more accessible place near the Palazzo della Signorina, main square of the city. So on the right-hand side, the lower right picture, we see the Palazzo della Signorina. That's the palace, and that's where the governors sat in Florence, and where they would have city meetings. So you can see that the statue that's out there right now is actually a fake. It's not the actual Michelangelo's David. That David is in a museum, but there is there's another one out there that's just a replica of it. And that's where it stood as the symbol of the Florentine people. And they really took that symbol under their wings for Florence and what Florence was. So really quick, we're going to go back because we have a little extra time and look at, again, this sense of power by Michelangelo. And we're also going to look at his figures, the actual muscles, the movement, the hands, and everything is quite phenomenal. And we're going to look a little bit more in class at the differences between the Donatello and the Michelangelo, and more than just what they represent, but their style. Sorry for the barking dog. She's being a little angry. A wonderful winter break. This is your last video for this. We will start up reviewing with some Botticelli and with Michelangelo when you guys return for midwinter break on Monday. We will also be getting into Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling on Monday as well, and Da Vinci. So come ready to class, ready to rock and roll. I'll give you a new packet, and you guys enjoy the rest of your break. Signing off.